Okay, hello everybody. So we're just opening this up a few minutes early to ensure that we've got all of our presenters in the presentation mode. George or Jorge, could you just unmute just to make sure we can hear you? We've tried to.
Hi Robert, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, loud and clear. Super. And would it be possible just to test your screen sharing before we get started?
Absolutely. Let's try that. Let me just go ahead and put presenter mode in my slides and okay.
And is it Jorge or George?
Jorge, yes.
Jorge. Vale, okay.
Thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Well, let's give it a minute or two and then we'll start. So thanks very much for just confirming that's working. Okay. We're nearly on the dot for one. And Jorge, is it early for you? Early morning? Where are you based?
Very early, Robert. 6 a.m. Yeah.
I hope
I hope I have the brains to do the presentation today.
And
Thank you for joining so early.
Yeah, you'll have 20 minutes when Tawanda's presenting to collect your thoughts and things. So, and thank you for joining so early. And sorry the timing's difficult. Okay, everybody. Well, let me get started then. So, firstly, a warm welcome to the International Conference on Children and Their Families using the Multiple Indicator Cluster Surveys. So my name is Robert Bain, and I'm chairing today's session on climate change. I'm the regional coordinator for mixed surveys in the Middle East and North Africa, one of the regions that's obviously most affected by climate change and particularly heat, which I think we'll hear a bit more about during this session. My co-chair is Ivana Bjelic, who's the Statistics and Monitoring Manager, and our lead on all things data processing as part of the Global Mix team. So thanks, Ivana, for co-chairing. So before I go to introducing our two speakers today, I just wanted to go through a few words of housekeeping. So firstly, the session will be recorded and hosted on the UNICEF Mix YouTube channel and website, as well as on the Bristol Poverty Institute YouTube, as well as integrated into their website. By attending this session, you're consenting to being part of the recording. Please do ensure that your names are included. So rather than being listed as guest, that will help us monitor attendees and know who's asking the speakers questions. So in terms of asking questions, it will be through the Q&A function, which you'll see in the top of your screen. We've disabled the chat, so you'd have to put your questions in the Q&A. And we may not be able to answer every question depending on how many come through in the time, but we'll endeavour to cover all of them. So lastly, just please be respectful. All of the events are being monitored, and we reserve the right to remove attendees if any comments are deemed offensive or derogatory. We're not expecting that to be the case, but we reserve that right. So in this session, I'm really looking forward to the two presentations. There'll be 20 minutes each, and will be followed by about 20 minutes of Q&A, which will take us to the full hour. Our first presentation, which will be by Tawanda Chingozha, who's based in UNICEF's Zimbabwe office, will focus on examining the nexus between child food poverty, nutrition and climate shocks, using mixed data and geospatial data in Zimbabwe. So that will be a fascinating piece that's a collaboration between UNICEF and WHO. Then we'll pass to Jorge Cuartas, who's calling us from New York, I think, very early in the morning, 6 a.m. And he is jointly affiliated between New York University and the University of the Andes, together with a few co-authors who I'll ask you to introduce during your presentation, if that's okay, Jorge. And this will cover the impact of excessive heat on early childhood development. So bringing in data on on heat and linking that to the mixed data on early childhood development, which should be very interesting. And I'm looking forward to hearing how you've done that, Jorge. Okay, so without further ado, let me pass to Tawanda. If you'd be happy to load your slides.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, a very good morning to everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank the session chairs and also acknowledge my my co-authors in the study. But before I jump into the presentation, I just want to clear up a few things. So really, our main message here is that we are advocating and supporting the routine collection of mixed geocode because it enables us to link the mixed data with geospatial data. Geospatial data is advantageous in the sense that it's more exogenous, it's more available, and it's more objective, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where sometimes surveys might be scarce. Secondly, I just want to put this disclaimer that this is very preliminary work, and in a huge sense, the study is very explorative. So we are looking at child food poverty as well as malnutrition. For malnutrition, we're looking at three forms of malnutrition. So we've got four variables, four endogenous variables, which are driven by very different processes. So it's very fashionable to say climate affects everything, but what we do in a sense is try and explore really what are the factors that are determining each of these processes, because we think it's important. It's important for for policy and programming. And I'll just make a big claim here that maybe for child food poverty, if you go into a household, for example, with the resources and the education, you might actually turn around the situation for child food poverty like the next day. But that might not necessarily be the case for for malnutrition, things like stunting, overweight, and wasting. We think these are more like medium to long-term processes, whereas child food poverty could affect it more or less in the short term. So with that, I'll just jump into the presentation. Are my slides moving?
Not right now. Would you mind trying again?
Okay, if you can just.
That's working. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So, Zimbabwe is an unfinished agenda. We've got problems of malnutrition. We find that the child food poverty. We find that almost 25% of children under 5 are affected by child food poverty, the severe case of child food poverty, whereas the total child food poverty sits at around 80%. This is as at the 2019 mixed wave. So the country is on track to meet some SDG targets with respect to malnutrition in terms of this first point in terms of reducing child wasting and overweight, but it still has got some work to do in terms of reducing stunting and anemia, as well as reducing low birth weight, as well as increasing exclusive breastfeeding to the threshold that are shown on the screen there. So I'm saying against the background of all those constraints, all those problems, climatic shocks impose additional constraints, and we're able to measure that using geospatial data. So if I'm not if I'm correct, mix doesn't have a standalone household shocks module that captures household shocks such as drought, if I'm not mistaken. So I think geospatial data is quite useful as we put across as one of our main messages. So we look at trends, we look at the evolution of child food poverty using the 3 recent waves of mixed data in Zimbabwe to look at what's happening to child food poverty, what's happening to malnutrition, and what are the determinants, which is key for programming and policy action. In terms of study contributions, we think our study is important because it is examining child food poverty and malnutrition simultaneously, because these things are not mutually exclusive. There is an interplay between and amongst them. So we try and look at them together to see what kind of policy conclusions we can come up with. We extend the household stress model by looking at beyond these idiosyncratic risks at the household level. What are some of those external things that are coming from the biophysical environment that might also affect our child food poverty and malnutrition? We think that combining mixed and geospatial data brings in more exogeneity, more availability, and more objectivity. We think it's an important contribution. Then lastly, we position child food poverty is not only affected by contemporary demand and supply factors, by long-term institutionalized factors such as disease, environment, agriculture potential and things like. So we're taking from institutional economics theory, trying to combine these two different strands of literature. So in terms of the brief literature review, I think it's a given that child food poverty and undernutrition, these are bad things. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, we find that over half of children's deaths, under 5 deaths, are attributed to some aspects of lack of food security and quality of their diet. So it's obviously a problem in sub-Saharan Africa. Raymond et al. Posits that the cost of undernutrition can actually be as high as 10% of the gross domestic product. So this is actually a huge a problem. So in terms of the development and learning potential of their children, child food poverty and malnutrition are also quite bad. If children experience these things early on in their childhood, it's going to affect their development, even their own parenting ability. So we have to be able to combat these. But to combat these problems, we have to understand what are some of those that what are some of the factors that determine them. So that's sort of the key messages we are trying to come up with here. In terms of the conceptual framework, like I mentioned, we take off from the family stress model following Cogent and others. So we're saying, in the short term, on the demand side, we might be looking at the illness of a breadwinner or another shock that affects the household, that imposes constraints and results in family stress. So family stress, we are saying, due to lack of income, poor quality jobs, lack of employment, the parent might be stressed to such a way that adversely affects the extent to which they can take care of their children, including meeting the dietary requirements of the children. In terms of the long term, at the household level, the family stress model, we are looking at cultural or traditional or other socio-economic factors, the education of the mother, their occupation, household occupation, food system, food ecosystem behaviors. On the supply side, you look at maybe market imperfections, right? Maybe there are poor roads in this locality, such that the prices of food, kind of skyrockets, because of the absence of roads. So this is on the family side, on the family stress side of the model. So we extend this by looking at factors coming from the external biophysical environment, mainly looking at, for example, in the short term, we are looking at maybe drought in the previous season and how does it affect child food poverty, how does it affect malnutrition? So this is the kind of short-term dynamic we are looking at here. In terms of the long-term, we are looking at maybe things like continued exposure to drought, continued exposure to climatic events that might affect child food poverty as well as malnutrition. Because remember, like I said, we think that malnutrition might be driven by a kind of medium to long-term process, whereby child food poverty might be a kind of short-term, more of a short-term phenomenon. So in our explorative study, we bring in, short-term drought, we bring in long-term drought, we bring in some of this factor to really see what is driving what. In terms of the methods, remember, this is also important for the programming of the Zimbabwe Country Office. So we want to see the evolution of child food poverty. We want to see the evolution of malnutrition. We are using 3 recent waves of mix. That's 2009, 2014, and 2019 for malnutrition. But for child food poverty, we are only able to calculate that for 2014 and 2019. So we show some tables, some charts, some maps, and also do some multivariate analysis to determine the factors affecting child food poverty and malnutrition. So there is our model. So on the left-hand side, our endogenous variable is VI, which is our vulnerability measure. So we run about 4 or 5 different sets of regressions. So it's more or less the same model. So we want to see in each model for child food poverty, which factors are important, right? For malnutrition, for the case of stunting, for the case of overweight, for the case of wasting, which factors are important? It's more or less in the explorative study we are trying to do here. So the main, independent variable we are trying to test is the effect of drought, right? To complete our conceptual framework, we then also introduce a measure of household stress. Then we also control for the disease environment. And then we control for some household level factors. That's this vector XI, which are things like, if the child is, breastfed. Okay, sorry, XI is actually area level factors, things like food prices in the area. Do we have livestock in the area? Because the calculation of child food poverty involves actually, looking at whether the child is consuming some flesh foods and things like that. So we want to see whether there are livestock, maybe that can, actually help supplement the household diet. We are looking at whether the locality is urban or rural. Then H, these are the, the household level factors. You're looking at if the child is breastfed, wealth scores, and all those other factors that are there. So the disease environment here, we are using, the distribution of the Morsitans tsetse index. So in the seminal work by Ausan, they find that, the historical disease environment, the distribution of disease affects contemporary developmental outcomes. We want to see if that is also true for child food poverty and malnutrition. So in terms of our data, I think I've already mentioned that we use those 3 waves of mix, 2009, 2014, and 2019. So we were fortunate that we were able to obtain mix geocode for the recent wave of mix for Zimbabwe for mix 2019. Would have been happier to have the geocode for all the other previous rounds. So because we only got the geocode for 2019, we're actually doing our examination as a form of a cross-section study. Would have wanted to look at this maybe as a kind of a repeated cross-section or kind of a pseudo panel to really see the dynamics of child food poverty and these factors affecting it, as well as malnutrition. So the mixed geocode we get, these are not the actual coordinates, they are displaced. I haven't read the UNICEF methodology in terms of how they display this, but in terms of the DHS methodology, in rural areas, these coordinates are randomly displaced within a radius of 5 kilometers, in urban areas within a radius of 2 kilometers. So there's some bit of measurement error there. Although these geocodes allow us to be a bit more precise in terms of our measurement, without these geocodes, we would have to rely on provincial identifiers, right? So we've got 10 provinces in Zimbabwe, and for each household, we know the province, right? So in the absence of the geocodes, we can extract these geospatial, variables using a provincial level shapefile. But we only have got 10 provinces, so you can imagine using only 2014 and 2019 waves of mix, you'd only have 20 data points, for whatever geospatial variable you're extracting, which is also a bit noisy because you're assuming that the entire province has got the same, measure or same value for drought, for example, or for another, variable that you might be including. So this is a very good thing that we've got this mixed geocode. Of course, there's measurement error in terms of this displacement, but I think, we shouldn't worry about that too much, as opposed to having to extract information at a much aggregated administration level. So those are the geocodes that we see on the right-hand side, and on the left is just the procedure of displacement. So we extract using these buffers that we create. For these geocodes, we create buffers around them, then extract data based on them. So I just want to, briefly, discuss some of these key variables before I present some of the results. So child food poverty, according to the UNICEF methodology, a child is in severe child food poverty if they consume 2 or less, foods out of these 8 food groups, right? If they consume 4 or less, they are in a moderate child food poverty. So this is how we calculate child food poverty based on this UNICEF methodology. Moving on, data on malnutrition, we use the Z scores for the standard anthropometric measures. So we consider stunting, wasting, and overweight. Then our drought variable is based on the standardized precipitation evaporation index, SPEI, which is an off-the-shelf drought measure that we have used. Other studies have used like rainfall, precipitation, and then kind of try and calculate the deviation from long-term mean to kind of reflect drought. So this is SPEI, and this is how we interpret it. If SPEI is less than minus 1.5, we say that there is a severe drought. If it goes beyond -2, then it's an extreme case of drought. So what we do is we say for each cluster, right? If the SPEI is less than minus 1.5, we then create a dummy that takes a value of 1 or 0. So we are actually measuring the effect of severe or extreme drought. So we do this for the planting season for Zimbabwe, which is December to February, because drought would affect predominantly agriculture. Families will rely predominantly on agriculture. So this is our drought variable. So we're saying for each of the 3 months in the planting season, December, January, and February, if in at least 2 of those months, SPEI was less than minus 1.5, we say there was a drought in that season. And then we count from 1980 how many times this cluster, and by extension households in this cluster, were exposed to drought. So we have a measure which is called drought frequency, which is a long-term measuring the long-term exposure to drought, which is important. We think it might be driving things like malnutrition. In addition to that, since we are now using 2019 data, because we only got the geocode for 2019, we consider whether in the previous farming season, in the 2018 to 2019 farming season, was there a drought? And we think that a recent episode of drought might better explain child food poverty, as I'll be showing in the results. So this is, I think I've already spoken about this. This is the disease environment. You find that it's the distribution of tsetse fly is clustered in the northwestern areas of the country, and we also test that to see whether the distribution of tsetse fly, the disease environment, because it affects it affects the growth of animals, it affects economic activities, which by extension might actually affect the socioeconomic status of the household. We want to see what effect does it have. So this is like a kind of a historical long-term distribution to say that these child food poverty and malnutrition might actually be affected by long-term processes, and you want to test whether this is so true or not. Then I think I've already spoken about having livestock. Previously, we controlled for cattle, the number of cattle in the area, but we think it's more likely that a household would would actually slaughter a chicken or a goat as opposed to a whole beast, a whole cow, to supplement the household diet. So we also control for this to see whether it's important in our model. So these are the summary statistics. I won't spend too much time, but just to highlight that. So the SPI drought frequency has got a mean of 2.78. So we're saying on average, a household suffers like 2.78 chance of a drought over this long period of time we are looking at from 1980 to 2018, which is rather low because you are looking at this extreme occurrence of a drought. So moving on, these are some of the national trends of child food poverty. We see that if you look at the total child food poverty, the green line, we see that it slightly went down from 2014 to 2019, which is important. Thumbs up to the programming teams in Zimbabwe. Then in terms of malnutrition, we find that it's only the share of overweight that has been consistently on the decline since 2009 up to 2014 and 2019. Whereas for the share of stunted and the share of children who are wasted, we saw a rise, a peak in 2014 and then a decline around about 2019. We also show these things by provincial, this is spatial distribution, which is important from a targeting and policy intervention point of view to say, for example, in this case, would say as a 2014, this Smart South province, Matabeleland South, would be the worst affected province by child food poverty. But I won't spend too much time on this. I want to go and show you some of the results. These are the national trends, sub-national trends for malnutrition, wasting, overweight, as well as the case of stunting. Okay, so this is our first set of results. So because we are measuring, we have got also data, we are measuring our child food poverty as a dummy variable, takes the value of 1 or 0. We run a multinomial probit, and what we find for the severe, so if you look at columns 1 to 4, this is the regression where severe child food poverty is our endogenous variable. So we are adding controls progressively. In column 1, it's a baseline regression where we only have got child food poverty on the left-hand side of the regression, and whether or not there was an episode of drought in the previous farming season, right? And we find that it's statistically significant. We would have wanted this to be statistically significant at 1%, but this is what we see in these preliminary estimates. But at least it's robust even as we add controls progressively. The coefficient for drought occurrence in the previous farming season seems to be significant. So there's a higher log odds, of having a case of child food poverty in the household if in that cluster there was a drought episode, right? So columns 5 to 8 are just showing the case for total child food poverty, but I think our measure should be child food poverty. But just for robustness, even for total child food poverty, we see some stats, although it's quite weak at 10%, the statistical association. For disease environment in column 2, this tells us that areas where there is a high probability of disease are likely to have children with severe child food poverty, but it's only significant only in column 2. It's not robust across the other columns. So I think I'll just focus on my main variables here since I'm also running out of time. So what I don't show here is that we also control for, we try and control for long-term exposure, that drought frequency variable. How many times from 1980 did this cluster experience drought? There's no relationship whatsoever with child food poverty. So we think child food poverty might be explained by the short-term cycle of drought. Moving on, What we then do, we've got 3 forms of malnutrition: stunting, wasting, and overweight. We first show results for the case for being malnourished, right? So if in the household we've got a child who is either stunted or wasted, we assume that there's a child who is malnourished. So this is the regression there. So the chance of being malnourished is also another multinomial probit. Seems to be explained by household stress. I didn't mention how we are defining our household stress. We still have to make improvements in terms of defining that variable, but we are assuming that there's a household stress in the household if there was ever a time that this child under 5 was left in the care of another child who's below 10. So it's a proxy we are using now. So we think that household stress does affect, although sometimes we don't see its robustness, especially in this final specification, but we think household stress might actually affect malnourishment, being the probability of being malnourished. In terms of the short-term drought or the long-term drought, we don't see anything here in terms of being malnourished. Moving on, this is a case for stunting. The first previous presentation, the results were for the general case of malnourishment, right? And we think that what the results tell us is that household stress is also important for stunting here, as well as the long-term exposure to drought to a very minimal extent. But I think the household stress model is important here. Moving on to wasting, the estimates are not as strong, but I had to rush through some of these results. Then for overweight, I think I mentioned that the results are not as strong. Then these are some of our findings. We think that drought in food in previous season and wealth scores adversely affects child food poverty. Mother education and wealth are also important, whereas results of other variables are not as robust, but we keep improving our study. In terms of malnutrition, we think that household stress is what is driving things here. Then in terms of stunting, location in urban areas, breastfeeding, wealth scores, ownership of the dwelling are also important. Then for wasting, we think the disease environment is important. Then just to conclude, we think that the study is important by showing these subnational trends. We are making the case for routine collection and availability of mixed geocode. We think it's important. We think that climate is important also, but not always. And also the education of women and girls is important. And also household stress. We think it's quite key. So this would be the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for following along. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Tawanda. I think it's a really nice example of using the new geocodes from MIX in Zimbabwe. I think it was interesting for me seeing how you brought in disease as well as the climate shocks and trying to control for some of those multiple things that are affecting child food poverty. I think that's very neat. Okay, so I have a few interested questions around things like seasonality, how you handled that. Interested also in sort of some of the decisions. So I saw that you brought in layers related to density of cattle, but the data set probably had some information on livestock ownership. So there's some choices that you've made there that would get more into the Q&A. But thank you very much. I gave you a minute or two, but you did manage to get through the 30 slides in 20 minutes, so well done. So I'll pass to Jorge next, if you'd be happy to load your slides. And we'll shift gears to thinking about ECD. And the impact of heat. Over to you, Jorge, and thank you.
Okay, let me unmute myself and now share my screen.
Yeah.
There you go. I think it should be working now. Okay, thank you very much for having me today and for joining this session. The title of my talk is The Impact of Excessive Heat on Early Childhood Development. My name is Jorge Cuartas. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Applied Psychology at New York University, and also a researcher at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. And my co-authors in this work are Andrés Camacho from Universidad de los Andes, Lenin Balza from the Inter-American Development Bank, and Nicolás Gómez from the International Monetary Fund. So in these 20 minutes, I'm hoping to cover the background for this research, also a conceptual framework to think about the links between heat and early childhood development, then to present some preliminary methods that we are considering for this study, preliminary findings, and finally some next steps and implications for research, policy, and practice based on these results. And it's important to note that all of this work is quite preliminary, so any feedback, any suggestions would be greatly appreciated as well. So for the background, I think that you'll have heard and know that climate change is producing profound impacts on human livelihoods and survival. Actually, it has been called one of the biggest threats for human survival globally, also for our economy, for our societies, our communities. And even though temperatures are rising globally, according to data, I think that all of us have also been experiencing and seeing, at least in the news, more and more information on other climate hazards, such as extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and even the spread of vector-borne diseases, which are byproducts of the climate crisis as a whole. And only thinking about temperature, we have data such as this showing that 2023 was the warmest year on average on record, which is quite concerning, which was also about 1.18 Celsius above the average temperature that we have experienced throughout our history. However, despite this, and despite the fact that there's growing awareness and discussion on the potential effects that this may have on children in particular, there is surprisingly little empirical evidence on extreme temperatures and early childhood development specifically. And most of the work and the evidence related to this tends to focus mostly on health outcomes, but not that much on early developmental outcomes. This is important to consider for several reasons. One of them is that thanks to UNICEF, actually, we have very good evidence of how young children are experiencing more and more climate hazards. Actually, about 99% of children around the globe experience at least one climate hazard, such as hurricanes or extreme temperatures or atypical rain patterns and floods and droughts. But this work by UNICEF, the Climate Risk Index, also shows that about 1 billion children, or half of children in the world, tend to experience what it's called in this index an extremely high risk for climate hazards. And this is because exposure to these environmental hazards, and at the same time, due to inadequate access to basic goods and services such as clean water and other sources of protection, which are even more needed in these climate hazard situations. Studying heat is also interesting because temperatures that are significantly higher or excessive heat can happen in any given location. So here we are not talking about a temperature that is above a certain threshold, for example, but we are talking mostly about temperatures that are higher to what we are used to in the specific location where we are based. And this is important because our bodies are tuned to maintain a core temperature. We tend to work on doing this through redistributing blood, for example, toward the skin and sweating. And when we experience excessive heat, this can overwhelm our biological temperature control systems and can cause something that is known as heat stress, which basically overloads our body and can lead to other biological consequences and even to psychological stress because our bodies experience this as a potential threat to our well-being or our survival eventually. The focus on early childhood is also because this is a sensitive period of development. You all may have heard that early childhood is a period of rapid brain and skill development, which is shaped by experience. So our context, the experiences that we have profoundly shape the type of skills that we develop, as well as our biological development. And this has very important implications for our lifelong trajectories. Actually, there's a lot of experimental and observational longitudinal evidence on how early brain development and early cognitive, social, emotional, and motor development predicts future outcomes, such as, for example, academic achievement, also risky behaviors in adolescence, also lifelong health and well-being, and even economic outcomes such as labor market participation and earnings in the future. Probably due to what we call developmental cascades, which is the fact that early skills can facilitate or hinder the development of future skills, not only in the home, but also as we transition to school and to other spaces and moments of our lives. So yeah, I think that I already covered this. And then when we think about the potential links between excessive heat and early childhood development, there are several different mechanisms. I'm going to cover or mention only a couple of those in this presentation in the interest of time. The first one that it's important to consider is that heat can affect young children more than adults for several reasons. The first one is that their small bodies heat up more quickly. Their developing biological systems are also less capable to release heat via sweating. And also children depend entirely on adults to seek water or cooler environments when they experience excessive heat. So there's like an implicit vulnerability that children experience with heat. Second, we have also plenty of evidence on how heat undermines sleep quality. And we also know that sleep is critical for the healthy growth and development of children. So this could be another mechanism linking heat and early childhood development. And finally, and I already mentioned this a little bit, the brain detects excessive heat as a potential threat. And we know that in early childhood, excessive stress, for example, or the body experiencing stress due to these potential contextual threats can have significant implications. Actually, while experiencing stress from time to time is totally normal, and it's actually adaptive for us to survive and to respond to potential threats. When this stress is repeated or is what we call toxic, it can lead to disruptions in the healthy brain, biological and skill development early in life. Other mechanisms that could be important when thinking about heat and early childhood development relate actually to parenting. So we have growing evidence also on how excessive heat can disrupt hormones and neurotransmitters that tend to regulate irritability and aggression. We also have actually some evidence on how heat can impair cognitive and executive function skills. So this evidence comes from adolescents and young adults. There's a lot of evidence, for example, on how excessive heat before standardized tests is linked to reduced achievement on these tests. And altogether, these impacts on hormones, irritability, aggression, cognition, and executive function are quite consequential when thinking about parenting, because parenting is a cognitive and emotionally demanding task that requires a lot of cognitive and emotional resources. So these potential impacts of heat can definitely interfere with parenting and can increase things such as impulsive reactions, potentially aggressive reactions, and also reduce families and parents' availability, for example, to engage in stimulation and early learning opportunities. And finally, a last mechanism I would like to mention is a very direct one, a very logical one, which is the fact that excessive heat makes outdoor environments less safe and comfortable. And this can reduce children's engagement in physical activity or learning opportunities outside the home. Actually, there's some evidence from the US showing how in warmer days, children tend to spend less time in physical activity and more in sedentary behaviors, which can have implications for their development, not only their motor development, but also cognitive and social emotional development, as children tend to interact with other children and adults when they are engaging in these outdoor activities. And this, of course, can also impose some barriers to attending early childhood education and also accessing other learning opportunities early on. So in this particular study, we are interested in understanding the potential consequences of excessive heat on early childhood development, also exploring some potential mechanisms or mediators, such as a health mechanism, also parenting, and also reduced learning opportunities. And finally, we're interested in looking at moderation or variation in these effects. Thinking about the methodology, we are using data from the MIX. So the MIX is this wonderful set of data that I personally have been using in a lot of different studies on physical punishment, early childhood development, and also parenting. But for this particular study, we are focusing on 14 mixed surveys with spatial data, in particular with the cluster location geocoded. Right now, we are in the process of data cleaning and merging, but so far we have some initial results that I would like to present today. And we are also using data from the ERA 5 land, which is a fantastic data set with high resolution information on surface variable, in particular data such as temperature and precipitation, and it provides data from 1950 to the present, which very high resolution data in general. We took together these two data sets and combined them spatially. So this is just an illustration from Nigeria on how the data looks like. We have the clusters and we have the temperature data for the country as a whole. So using this information, we have been calculating an exposure variable for excessive heat, which is the average maximum temperature in different moments of development. So we are thinking about calculating the average maximum temperature that each child experiences prenatally in different periods prenatally, for example, 9 to 6 months before birth, 6 to 3, and 3 to birth. Then postnatally in different developmental moments as well, 0 to 6 months, 6 to 12, 1 to 2 years, and 2 to 3 years. And also different exposures prior to the service. For example, 1 month before the survey, 3 months, and 6 months. What I'm going to show you today is not on this exposure level in particular, but it's actually the average maximum temperature that each child has experienced throughout their lives. So please keep that in mind, because all of these exposure variables are planned for the future, but so far we are working on that data. For the outcome measures, we have data from the ECDI for most of these surveys. So with the ECDI, we have measures of literacy numeracy, physical development, social emotional development, and approaches to learning. We also have 3 data sets with data from the ECDI 2030, which I'm really excited to start working with. And we also have measures of health and nutrition, such as stunting, unhealthy weight, diarrhea, incidence, and also infection. Then for parenting, I'm using data on caregivers' engagement on 6 play and learning activities in the 3 days preceding the survey, which I'm using to construct an stimulation index. I also have data on caregivers' use of physical punishment and psychological aggression in the past month, which I'm hoping also to use to test this idea that heat can increase aggression, and in particular, aggressive parenting behaviors. Finally, we also have indicators for children's attendance to early childhood care and education centers. So using this data, we are hoping to use a quasi-experimental approach, leveraging the temporal and spatial variation in surveys, children's birth dates, and cohorts relative to this temperature data, basically leveraging differential exposure to heat between cohorts, exploring this variation. And we are hoping to estimate regression models for these different exposure variables that I just presented, including fixed effects for cohorts, but also fixed effects for seasonality, to try to capture some of the seasonality for temperature in general. We are also hoping to include fixed effects by region, so not only by country, but also by the sub-regional divisions that we have in the mix. This also tries to capture the more chronic exposure to heat and differential temperature across settings, and in doing so to try to capture something that we would like to argue is exogenous variation of excessive heat, or heat that is above what is usually experienced in a given setting and also in time. And finally, to allow for non-linearities in the association between heat and the outcome variables, we are using something that is kind of typical in the economics literature in particular, which is using exposure bins. So instead of assessing an association between a linear variable of heat and the outcome. We take this exposure variable and divide it into bins, for example, temperature between 29 and 31 degrees, 31 to 33, and so on. So with that in mind, I'm going to present two very initial preliminary findings. I'm hoping to continue working on this, and hopefully in a future conference or in the future, I can share more detailed findings from this work. But what we are finding so far is actually quite promising, quite concerning as well, because what we are seeing is that when we compare these increased bins of temperatures, so 29 to 31 and so on, with temperatures below 29 degrees, we start to see reductions in the ECDI total scores. Actually, only last week, I was checking some additional models, including region fixed effects and also seasonality fixed effects. And we are finding something that it's even more striking, which is kind of a gradient with increasing temperatures leading to lower ECDI scores, almost in a linear fashion. So we have this. We also have some initial evidence for the stimulation, which is a little bit less consistent, even though it's always on the negative side of things and statistically significant, in general, showing also that higher temperatures tend to associate to lower stimulation scores or lower engagement in stimulation activities in the days preceding the survey. So with this, we are hoping to continue working on our data cleaning and analysis, including, for example, these region and seasonality fixed effects, and also working on disseminating these findings. And the hope is also to continue expanding this work, not only to consider excessive heat, but also precipitation, pollution, and other climate hazards to better understand how the chronic and acute impacts of climate change may affect children and families using the mixed data. And with that, we conclude. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, and you can feel free also to write to my email if you have any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Yeah, fascinating preliminary results there. And I think, again, similar to the study that Tawanda sort of showed us, I think climate is in many ways one of the strongest arguments for governments to be sharing the GPS coordinates, because it allows you to combine these shocks and understand some of the patterns that we're seeing in their national surveys. So I think, yeah, it's really interesting. I guess you have a relatively limited number of countries that have ECDI, especially ECDI 2030 and GPS coordinates, but establishing the methodology will mean that in 2-3 years' time, hopefully there'll be a good number to work with. So we have 15 minutes left. I want to open for questions. I can see that Julian Rochert has posted a question in the chat. I do encourage others online to also ask your questions. And I'll pass to Ivana to run us through those. Thanks, Ivana.
Thank you, Rob, and many thanks to our presenters. We would indeed encourage all attendees to ask questions or provide comments to these two excellent presentations. We do have one question, as Rob already indicated, and I myself also have a question that I will add. So a question, Rob, if you have some questions, please follow right after I pose these two. Both questions will be to Tawanda. The first question is from Julian, and it is related to the consideration of including geographical fixed effects in your estimation strategy, Julian. Is this something that you have considered? As it could potentially help you to compare households living in a specified geographical area to the households living in the very same areas as well. So that would be the first question. The second question will come from me, and I think that Rob kind of already indicated that in his comments right after your presentation. It's related to the conditions that applied to your choices of selection of the variables. In particular, I am interested in your selection of the variables, for example, for the livestock ownership. We see that you have used the additional resource, which is really great, linking mixed to other resources. I think it's very important, and it goes into this further data exploration and further analysis that can open up like a very, very rich possibilities. But wondering, were you considering adding the household ownership of livestock that is part of mix as well? I see that there was an ownership of agricultural land that was included, and also if there is a particular reason for not including into the household under household stressor condition children staying alone in house, right? I know that you noticed that it's including children left in care of another child younger than 10 years, though it's a very rare event. We do have some evidence. I don't know if it was particularly the case in Zimbabwe, mixed data sets, but I know in other surveys that there have been indications of children being left alone as well, and not only in the care of another child. So those are the two questions at this moment. And I don't know, Rob, if you would like to add any question on your end, and we still have some time for other attendees to pose questions.
Well, why don't we start with those two for now, Ivana, if that's okay. Thanks. So are you happy to come in on those two questions, Tawanda, to start with?
Yeah. Sorry, I was having a problem with my mouse, so I can go ahead and answer this too. Yeah. So yeah. I think Julian, you raised very important suggestion to consider geographical fixed effects. I think there was a suggestion to do that. So the way we want to try and do this is to control for the Food and Agriculture Organization's agroecological zones, right? So I think this should be, because the livelihoods in Zimbabwe, especially in rural areas, are mostly driven by their own production, agriculture, raising livestock. So I think if we control for the agroecological fixed effects, I think that would be a great starting point, because these agricultural fixed effects, there are some areas that are suitable for cattle, some areas are suitable for different types of crops. So I think that will also bring out which particular crops, which particular farming systems are affected by drought. So I think, we will definitely do that. Thank you very much for bringing that suggestion. So of course, one could also control for even district fixed effects, because we are measuring our geospatial data at the cluster, which is lower than the district. So I think we'd even bring in district fixed effects or even province fixed effects also to kind of measure some of those unobservables. Then I think this now relates to Ivana's question. I think you are right. I think I think the problem is this is just preliminary work. So I was more inclined towards the geospatial variables, because you find that they are more often more exogenous than self-reported responses. But I think it would be important also to test the self-reported information in the survey, because we don't see a lot of statistical significance anyway if we consider these chicken and goat data. That's kind of area level estimates. So I think, that's an important suggestion that we have to do. So point taken, we'll try and use information of the survey. And also thanks for your other suggestion of looking at children staying alone, like child-aided households. I think that would be a fantastic variable to test as well. So those would be my responses. Thank you.
Okay, maybe Ivana, so just sort of follow up on that one. I've worked on sort of associations of household and then kind of community risk factors on water quality, and I guess you could imagine treating the density of livestock as being kind of in general in this area, how much livestock is there, and then the kind of household one being much more immediate. It'd be interesting to kind of include both in the model to explore that. Jorge, I had one question for you, which is you might recall, I don't know, a few years ago, there was a sort of high-profile study, and I think I've just looked it up now in Nature, which was sort of heat and conflict, right? And obviously they have conflict, they'll have data that's at a relatively high resolution, and then they have the heat data, and they can kind of do it globally. I wondered whether it was ludicrous or whether you considered taking the ECD data for the countries that don't have GPS coordinates and doing a kind of rougher analysis, maybe at the level of representation that you have in the survey, because that might, you could kind of combine those two things and have a sort of coarse, more countries approach combined with your more detailed analysis for the 10 to 14 that have both. Is that something you've looked at or considered?
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we are thinking about doing separate analysis with other surveys without the geocoded data, but with some region data at least, some subnational data at least that we can impute temperatures to. And that would be great because that will allow us to use more mixed data, but also to combine it with demographic and health service data as well. Actually, with the DHS, there may be like more than 30 additional surveys we could potentially include doing so. So it would get us a very nice global representation of surveys. I guess that the only consideration there and the reason we are starting with these 14 mixed surveys is that as we go upper and upper with the region data for imputing exposure, our causal argument gets a little bit weaker because we are relying on having more precise geographical location and then using region fixed effects to compare people in the same region, and then to use also variation in cohorts and temporal exposure to heat. So as we go up, those fixed effects get a little bit trickier, and including country fixed effects, maybe it's not gonna make us do like a plausible causal argument there. So that's why we decided to start with this. But yeah, we definitely would like to expand. And if we find consistent results in any case, I guess we will have a strong case to make potential causal impacts of heat on ECD and also on parenting.
If you don't mind, Jorge, just one last question on my end. I know that you have mentioned that currently you're in the process of merging and cleaning the data for the 14 surveys that you have available with the GPS coordinates. Being a data manager myself, leading mixed data processing team, I would be a little bit curious about what that data cleaning process really involves, because it could help us also to understand better the needs of the researchers in terms of data formatting and any challenges that you may have in that regard. And I will use the opportunity to read another question from Julian, because I think we have still a little bit more time left, which is, are you planning to restrict your study to a certain region of the world, or using all the countries where GIS is available? Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana. Yeah, to begin with the second question, I'm planning to use all countries where data is available. My research in general focuses mostly in Latin America, but I also do a lot of global work, and in particular with the mix. I have been doing cross-cultural work. Actually, a mix has been a great tool for me to work on issues such as the potential effects of physical punishment, and all of that work has been globally in focus. We have also been doing work on the nurturing care framework, trying to understand, for example, the prevalence of different indicators of nurturing care using the mix, and that has been also global. So with climate change, I'm hoping to take a similar approach, global, and maybe then to start working in more specific areas, maybe using longitudinal data as well. But I think that the mix is a great start to start providing this evidence on climate change. For data cleaning, so I think that implies a lot of different steps. So one of the steps is to do the actual cleaning of the mix. in my team, at least, we have been doing data cleaning from scratch, downloading the data from the mixed data set, the mixed web page. So that, of course, implies a lot of harmonization of variables and yeah, like all the basic data cleaning. I know that a lot of people are also using now the EPUM's mixed data, which is also a great resource. I haven't used it that much personally, but yeah, I'd encourage people to check it out as well. But I guess that the most challenging part of the current data cleaning that we are doing is actually managing the heat data, the temperature data. It is huge, and given that it is so high resolution, we have information hour by hour of temperature, so it gets a little bit tricky to manage all that data. What we are trying to do is to do all of that data cleaning online in a server, and then only to export the actual exposure variables for the different time frames that we are considering. But yeah, thinking about the mix, I guess that at least when working with only one round, it's great that we have a good harmonization of data. In the mix 6, for example, you have all the names well harmonized, and that makes our jobs definitely easier.
Thank you for that explanation, and thank you for mentioning IPOM's mix and being the user of it. We are very happy to hear that like a large number of researchers are actually relying on it. And yes, that to understand also that merging these kind of data sets is also requires significant amount of work, because often we think, oh, we have 2 data sets available. It should now be a very straightforward process, but I guess it's always some kind of unpredictability that shows up. Well, that's all that I had in my pool of questions. I also don't see anything more coming from our audience, so I'm going to thank both presenters and pass over to Rob for closing the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana. And yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us today. I think we're just bang on time. So thank you for the presenters for keeping to time. I think both of these presentations are very interesting to me. We've had a lot of discussions in this region about the impacts of heat on children. I think a lot of it's focused on sort of education age, and you know, many of the things that you've highlighted in the framework are very applicable, and lots of gaps in our knowledge about the impacts of heat on children. Tawanda, similarly, you know, the impacts of drought in places like Sudan are obviously high on the cards here. So I think your study is going to be of very great interest to you know, a lot of people. And I wish you both the best in terms of finalizing those studies. I know you've presented preliminary results, and I think hopefully some of the feedback that you received today will give you some ideas as you wrap them up. So wishing everyone a good rest of your day, and we'll close the meeting now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.